Hello, this is Professor Kuehn, and welcome back to my lectures on astronomy. We've been looking at a book by Nicholas Copernicus that was published in 1543, the year of his death. This book is titled On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. We've been focusing in the last lecture on the Preface and Dedication to Pope Paul III, which is on page 131 in a student's guide to the great physics texts. We got about up to page 132, where he's explaining the reason that he decided for quite some time to leave this work unpublished until, in fact, the year of his death. And he says that this was not for fear that it would be condemned by leaders of the church, interestingly, but rather that it would be mocked by the unlearned, by those who had no desire to try to read and understand what he wrote. He was afraid of the people who would take it out of context and make fun of it without taking the time to study it. At this point, I'd like to ask you a somewhat controversial question, I think. I'd like to ask you this. Some of you are going to be, perhaps, teachers someday. What do you think? Is it the responsibility of the scholar, the teacher, or the professor to teach those who really have no desire to learn? After all, the Pythagoreans, as Copernicus mentions, and in fact Copernicus himself, thought not. In the end, just before his death, as I mentioned, he did decide to publish his work so that his knowledge might be transmitted to those who cared to read it. This brings us about to page 133, the second paragraph. Here he's noticing that even astronomers and mathematicians were in fact in disagreement about the correct arrangement of the celestial spheres around the Earth so that they might account for the motion of the planets. Remember, the idea that was very prevalent at the time was that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and there were spheres that were rotating around on which the planets were located. But in order to, quote, save the appearances, or to match theory to data, the data being the observations of the motion of the planets, one had to come up with a very sophisticated arrangement of these rotating spheres, including spheres that were not only centered on the Earth, but in fact some that were slightly offset or non-homocentric, eccentric spheres, and in fact epicycle spheres riding upon spheres that would carry the planets. Copernicus noticed that even among astronomers and mathematicians, there was considerable disagreement as to which ordering of these spheres would best account for the experimental observations. And so what does Copernicus do? He says that he decided to reread all of the works by the philosophers and to seek a better arrangement of these spheres, one that would seem more orderly and less ad hoc. Notice here that he is not saying necessarily that his arrangement is going to match the data better. Rather, he is going to try to find an arrangement of the spheres that seems more aesthetically appealing. There's an aesthetic judgment being made here that he had talked about in this preface, where he said that the arrangements that other mathematicians and astronomers had come up with seemed more like a monstrosity. It seemed ad hoc and unbeautiful, you might say, and he sought a more beautiful arrangement of the spheres. That's an interesting thing to keep in mind when you're considering what is the nature of science and how does one select among theories, more than one of which may correctly model the experimental data. That brings us to the bottom of page 133, where he mentions that he found some of the ancients, notably the Pythagoreans, who believed that the Earth was one of the planets. He says here, "Wherefore I took the trouble to reread all of the books by philosophers which I could get hold of, to see if any of them even supposed that the movements of the spheres of the world were different from those laid down by those who taught mathematics in the schools." These would be the previous thinkers that were teaching that the Earth was at the center. And, he goes on, "as a matter of fact, I found that in Cicero that Nicetas thought that the Earth itself moved. And afterwards I found in Plutarch that there were some others of the same opinion. I shall copy out his words here so that they may be known to all." And then he takes this quote from Plutarch. "Some think that the Earth is at rest, but Philolaus the Pythagorean says that it moves around the fire with an obliquely circular motion like the sun and the moon." So In other words, one of these Pythagoreans, Philolaus, believed that the Earth was moving around a central fire, like the other planets. Keep in mind, though, that he's not saying it's going around the sun necessarily, because the sun and the moon are also going around the central fire. So this is a controversial topic, whether the Pythagoreans actually believe that the Earth is going around the sun, or the Earth, like the sun and the moon, was traveling around a central fire. If we move on to page 134, in the top, he says that he began to meditate on this idea and to perform his own measurements. And he came up with a new arrangement that is orderly, so that, as he says, nothing can be shifted without disrupting the remaining parts. So the ordering of these celestial spheres that Copernicus is going to be advocating is one that everything fits together a bit like a perfectly ordered machine. By paragraph 3 on page 134, he is stating that he finally decided to publish his work so as to not hide his ideas, and he goes on to say that he's dedicating it to Pope Paul III, because Pope Paul III had a great love of letters, that is, of learning, and he had a love of math, and also to defend himself against the slanderers, those who would question his motivations and attack his work. He says specifically, "I preferred to dedicate these results of my nocturnal study to your holiness, rather than to anyone else, because even in this remote corner of the earth where I live," remember he's writing in northern Poland, "in this remote corner of the earth where I live, you are held to be most eminent both in the dignity of your order and in your love of letters, and even of mathematics. Hence, by the authority of your judgment, you can easily provide a guard against the bites of slanderers." By the bottom of page 134, he's talking about how some people, some of his opponents, will claim that the Holy Scriptures, Holy Writ, as he says, support the view that the earth is stationary, and in fact some argue that the earth itself is flat. Copernicus is writing primarily not to address some of these people, but he's writing to address the mathematicians and those who care to know.